On a chilly morning, that's when you're most in tune with your classic ride. Those few seconds of lumpy idle before fuel catches in all cylinders and the oil ways fill. You're hyper alert, listening for new noises and willing that temp gauge to register. The car is talking. It doesn't like a cold start any more than you do, but there's no drama. Because those days when the question of reliability destroyed the daydream of dailying a classic car are over. So if you aren't chasing that dream, you best ask yourself why. And when you've got a battle-ready machine, one of the sweetest rewards is adding those few touches that make it your own. So in this episode, the Daily Barge gets some optional extras. A driver's armrest, cruise control, and some classic spot lamps. It's a retrofit comfort pack. Stay tuned. Previously on Soup Classic Motoring. Our shakedown mileage has left us with a front end that's only sitting on the car and about half a field up in the wheel arches. So we just have to get all that cleaned out and the front end tacked on before we get into the fun stuff. Now I've been saving the headlamps for a rainy day, and things got rainy and windy. So back in the shed, let's take the peepers apart. One of them was decidedly the worst for wear, and as it turns out, the one that looked good because it had already been given some attention. You might notice one of these headlamps has a reflector between the two lamps themselves, and the other one doesn't. This, I believe, means that this headlamp came from a car that originally sold in South Africa. Spraying these lamps with high temperature paint isn't the greatest solution, but restrictions on budget and this whole project meant that it was the quickest solution for now. And this is the very reason the car's getting some auxiliary lamps later on. We're going to supplement the lighting situation rather than trying to fix it outright. And the other thing I found with the lamp that had already been sprayed was that the whole unit itself had been sprayed. There had been no masking off, and they were never going to match in appearance when I put them back together. So a quick dip in some thinners and a lot of rubbing later, and they're a little closer to being even. pro Mercedes W123 tip. If you take the bonnet off your car and the wings, put your bonnet hinges back in before you put the front wings back on. These aft bolts on the hinges are doable with the wings on, but it's a job for a contortionist. Just one last technicality before we fit the rest of the comfort pack. We've dropped this car 50mm on off-the-shelf springs, and that means all of our suspension geometry is out. Plus, all of the steering linkage have been off, whereas I've set it all to the factory baseline. It is only a baseline to have the car aligned from, and you can align a car fairly well with string and patience. This is one thing I wanted to have done with the most modern equipment possible, and I gotta say thanks to the guys at Best Drive who did a great job bringing the car back to factory alignment, camber and caster. Alright, so our headlamp situation. The factory lamps in this car are actually made by Hella, and I could have thrown a set of Hella driving lamps at it, but I fell in love with a set from Lucas, the Prince of Darkness. And in a way, these are great lamps because they've got beautiful stainless steel housings that take ye old standard 5 3/4 inch sealed beam lamp units. Plus, the stone guards are just that bit more reserved than you'd get on a Hella lamp. Now, I love to do stuff as practically and as neatly as I can, so I found 2 old W123 factory wiring connectors so that these lamps will be easy to plug in and out if I ever need to service them. And if you ask me, doing any wiring on a car, especially exterior stuff like this, it's all about sealing your wires so that damp can't get down the core of them. And if you look closely, you can see a shiny section at either end of the heat shrink I used. That's because it's resin lined. It's a marine grade heat shrink, and what happens is as it shrinks and heats up, an adhesive lining inside the heat shrink melts, liquefies and flows out to create a sealed joint. Anyway, now we need a way of mounting these lamps, and I've got just a piece of stainless steel. Okay, I said I'd like to do things neatly, so here's how I've wired these lamps. First things first. Main light switch. Turn all lights on. We pull out one click to activate the fog lights. Given all of the reflective material in their bowls is gone, they're kind of useless anyway, so they don't dazzle oncoming drivers. Now with our column stock, if we select high beam, we get high beam but also our new auxiliary lamps. But if I don't feel like using them, I can just turn the fog lamps off on the main switch. And we're back to just regular high-low beam and driving lights. And a nice thing about the stone guards on these lamps is they have little telltale windows in them. The cherry on the cake. The main switch on these Mercedes is a beautiful thing. It's like a power plant or something. It's got a multi-core 12 volt feed coming into it. And that's one to note on a W123 because the fog light terminal in this switch is the one directly above and behind that red 12 volt feed. So this is where we wire our 12 volt auxiliary lamp relay feed so that when the fog lights come on, we are also energizing the new auxiliary lamp system. I say energizing, we're really putting it on standby at the relay, not turning it on. What we do now is take a second 12 volt feed from the high-low beam switch on the column via its multi-plug, so that when the high beam is switched on, it triggers the relay to complete the circuit to the lamps. So now we have the option. We can have high-low beam with or without the new auxiliary lamps. Look, this all just means I haven't had to wire a crappy aftermarket switch and drill it somewhere into my dashboard. Now, what else makes up the comfort pack in a Mercedes W123? Well, friend of the series and patron Peter from the USA sent me a W123 armrest. The only trouble is, this armrest had a fight with the sunshine and lost, but Peter sent us some extra material and we made a valiant attempt at recovering this thing. And here's the kicker, the sewing machine, my mum's sewing machine, just wasn't powerful enough for this material to recover this thing nicely. At some point you have to sew 3 layers of this material together and it was just too much. But let me just tell you a little bit about a sewing machine, because it's nothing to be scared of. In fact, I'd say the same amount of practice that you'd need to get reasonably competent with a welder would have you running a decent stitch. A sewing machine is a beautiful piece of precision engineering. It's no surprise that this one is Swiss made. And if you ask me, there are a lot of comparisons between a sewing machine and a car. Well, firstly, this one has a foot pedal, but when we get down to brass tacks, there are lubrication points all over this machine. It is precisely timed so that as the needle sews down through your workpiece, a mechanism works to literally pull that workpiece through the machine, offering the needle a fresh piece of material at every stroke. The thread in the sewing machine like this actually comes from both above and below the needle so that you're sewing through from both sides at once. And the machine is tunable. Each of these black discs is a different stitch. This is like flash remapping your ECU to change the driving characteristics of the car. But like I say, even with a skilled sewing veteran like my mum trying to work this material, it was just too much for our machine. It did manage some stitches, but they were loose and easily pulled back through. So this is a battle we're going to have to revisit another time, when we find someone with the right machine and know-how. But this one time at band camp, and by band camp I mean the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we ripped a very large part off an even larger sail, and the 100-year-old hand-cranked Singer machine that we kept for just such an eventuality was brought very quickly into service. My stitches are dodgy as hell, but that sail got us safely to the Caribbean. So don't discount a sewing machine as a potential tool in your arsenal. Like anything, it's only a matter of practice. So for now, let's just get this armrest mounted. We've got an armrest, we've got a comfy seat, we've got good lighting. It might sound trivial, but I love having my feet flat on the floor. And luckily our W123 was a crossover model. In 1982 a new engine appeared, this 2.3 litre straight 4, which was carried on into the W124, the spiritual successor to our mid-range saloon. So I've been able to source this factory fitted VDO produced Tempomat system from a W124. A real nice guy called Joe was happy to take the whole thing out of a donor car he had, including the wiring, and send it to me. All we have to do, being conscientious, is test it before we put it in the car. So first things first, the actuator. It is just a motor with a solenoid that physically acts on the throttle in the engine bay. A simple 12-volt feed spins a motor in the actuator. That motor is disengaged unless another 12-volt signal activates a solenoid to bring the gears of the motor into contact with the gears of the actuator arm. It is as simple as that. These systems are live. There are no on-off switches in the car. There is just the column stalk to set your acceleration or deceleration. So the motor spins, the solenoid engages, and the arm rotates to physically hold your throttle at any given speed you choose to toggle the switch in the car. And our actuator is working fine. This isn't a comprehensive test. We haven't tested the resistance, but knowing that it notionally works is enough for now. When it comes to the wiring, there's only one thing we're going to modify here, and that is the speed sensor. And on the W124 system, that signal is picked up by a single plug. We have a double pin connection on the W123 speedometer, so I'm going to have to solder this wire onto that double connection. So again, I found an old Mercedes wiring connector that I can put in line in this speed sensor. One end can be soldered directly onto the speed sensor and the other end feeding into this plug, the other side of which travels down into the cruise control amplifier. Here's where we hit a bit of a stumbling block. Our cruise control came from a W124 version of this engine, and Joe, who sent the system, assured me there would be 3 flanges on the side of the block where the actuator would mount. Guess what? They just weren't on my car. So I had to go looking for another way of mounting this actuator. So what I've done is created a triangulation between a bolt that holds the transmission dipstick on the back of the block, the engine hoisting point on the back of the block, and a flange on the rocker cover that holds the throttle cable. All that was left to do is create some good sturdy bracing on the new bracket to take the 3 metal-elastic bushes that soft mounted the actuator on the original bracket. I love this bracket. for a couple of reasons, but one of them is it gave me the opportunity to use for the first time something called the dimple die. This one was made and donated by another friend of the series, Jer, and it's a 20mm die. These things are for lightening and stiffening brackets like this. All you have to do is drill a hole the same diameter as the center of the die, which in this case is 20mm, and then you literally press the die through that hole, creating a flange, which, like I say, by virtue of the hole lightens the piece and by virtue of the flange stiffens it. The very last piece of the puzzle here was to weld a ball to our throttle linkage that our cruise control actuator arm would sit on. I scavenged it from the original throttle body sent to me with the cruise control kit. And a few dabs of stainless steel MIG wire later, we've got a convincing cruise control actuator. And because our actuator is mounted so close to the bulkhead at the back of the engine, there was a lot of redundant wiring that ordinarily would have travelled almost all the way around the engine bay back through the bulkhead. So I cut that down and resoldered everything back together, albeit minus about 1.5 meters of length. And up on the steering column, it was time to mount the cruise control stalk. Cruise control on the Mercedes 123 was a very rare option in Ireland, and even in the UK. So the only switch I could get was sent to me by Peter as well with the armrest. It's an American switch designed to go on the opposite side of the steering column, but an American steering column. So the only way I could mount it was pointing downwards rather than upwards. It hugs the steering wheel quite closely, so it's in no danger of being hit by your knee as you get in and out of the car, and it falls in a very comfortable place. The only thing obviously being that instead of pushing it up as you would do in a standard fitment, you push it down to set it, and I will live with that. This is my stealth cruise control setup. Alright, I'm going to admit that with all that done, and despite having tested all of the wiring, the brake switch, the cruise control switch and the actuator, we still didn't have a functioning cruise control. So the last place to turn our attention is the cruise control amplifier, the brain of the system, and I decided to resolder all of the joints, and while I was at it, to replace some of the capacitors on it, like for like. And I'll make a further admission, the cruise control still isn't working. So this guy is gearing up with some new multimeter knowledge, resistance values and tools, and I will get to the bottom of this cruise control problem in this life or the next. But for now, we're done. And I can show you just how bad this car is on the outside, and prepare for a fright, because if you haven't noticed it already, for all of the welding and rust banishing goodness that we've done in the last 10 months, underneath the surface, the outside of this car is majorly challenged by rust. And in general, well, there's only one way of putting it, it's covered in crap, but I do not care. This is going to be a rolling resto rat rod, over winter at least, until I have some energy and better weather again to work on it. And in the meantime, it's more than enough car and more than enough comfort to get me across the country to sand and surf. Somehow this has been the most difficult episode I've ever produced, and the torture of winter hasn't even kicked in yet, so I am more resolved than ever. I need a workshop, and all efforts are now focused in that direction. So help a guy get off the drive. Hit the like button, comment, subscribe, and a big one, turn on notifications. That is huge for anyone you follow on YouTube. The sooner you can watch a video once it's released, the better it is for the creator. If you would like to lend support in the form of the price of a coffee or two a month, then follow the link in the description to my website, where there are two options, two ways you can do so. And to my new patrons, Amund Johannesson, Kevin Green, Paul Brown, Eves Morvan, Christopher Rosegg, Gregory Hutchinson, Vidotas Dambrauskas, Morgan Hoffman, Andy Hoffman, Philippe Savary, Michael A. Skinner, Deckel Santo, Ludas, Patrick Trant, Brian Johnston, August Rush, Andrew McGee, Robert Grabowski, Tom Griffiths, Timothy Findlay, Barry Ahern, Will Evans, Tyson Sadunary, Brian Smith, Ryan Moore, Simon Cushney, William Coperwatts, John Edverson, Elia Holiu, and Reese Frankland. And a special thanks to Phil Griffiths, Jimmy Sheehan, Peter Johnson, Paul Byrne, and all of the Kellys at Ned Kelly Mercedes, without whom I would not be here, and life with this car would be far less interesting. The Lotus Esprit is on the way. It's our winter project. Stay tuned for that. I am going to squeeze in a very small project just between now and then, something that will help me process the winter pressures. I'll say no more than that, and I'll be along with the reveal very soon. Put something warm on, stay stuck in, and good luck.